Well, hi everyone, and thank you for joining this event. This is, as you know, part of our continuing healing series. And today we're very excited to speak to Sheikha Al Habshi, and the talk is going to be moderated by Lara. Sheikha is a young but very accomplished artist, illustrator based in Kuwait. Sheikha works both in English and Arabic and produces work in both languages. And her art is mainly centered around identity and self-care as a form of coping in a highly technological age. She explores the idea of being torn between tradition and constant change, especially in the online arena, and her art focuses on women and other marginalized figures in Kuwait and across the Middle East. She also looks into how these figures evolve in digital spaces, as well as in more conservative settings. Sheikha uses her art as a way of taking up space, asking intelligent questions about gender roles and other such topics in a culture where tradition and privacy play a very important role. Thank you so much, everyone, again for joining. And over to you, Lara and Sheikha.
So thank you, Sheikha. We're very excited. Can you tell us about how you got started with illustrating?
Hi everyone. Thank you for joining again. I originally started off doing fashion. That was what I wanted to do for a very long time. I did fashion shows. I learned how to sew and everything. But after a while, that felt like that wasn't enough to be able to express myself and to express the things that I wanted to talk about. And so I think I've talked about this on multiple occasions, but I studied interior architecture in university, and one of my best friends, Faye, was an artist and an illustrator as well, and she used to draw constantly around me. And I love the way that she was able to express how she felt in any given moment, but I had to wait for my sewing machine back at home. And so I decided one day that who cares if I can't draw to save my life? I'm just going to draw something, because I saw these flowers in Nuer that comes up in Kuwait around this time of year. And I just wanted to post it as a form of, because at the time I was looking at a lot of self-care illustrations, and they would bring me a lot of comfort when I was going through anything. So I just wanted to do that one thing, and I posted it online and got 20 retweets, and I felt very famous for that day.
We can see how different your Instagram feed looked before, and you're almost at 10,000 followers. How does it feel for you to share stuff now that's so raw and personal?
I think, to be honest, I don't feel like it's as personal as my previous work, because now I feel like my work represents a larger community and collective, rather than before when it was genuinely just about me and my own issues. So I think it was someone once referred to it as exposure therapy, that when you expose yourself to so much vulnerability in the beginning, that now it just feels like it's stuff that I don't mind talking about. I feel like should be talked about. So it actually doesn't feel that weird to me anymore.
Do you feel like because of the support you got early on sharing your work, that now you kind of created this community of many people who are also feeling the same thing?
I think in the beginning I didn't feel like there were people who were just, I don't think anybody really saw that it was anything. Like I was telling my friend Faye, who when you opened me up to this whole kind of world, and I'd be like, if you weren't such a good liar, I would have never started drawing to begin with. Because the fact that she used to tell me that my work was good back then, I was like, I would have stopped if I didn't have someone who was telling me that my work was good. It was because she told me that, this is great. I would be like, okay, maybe I'll believe her. Like if at least one person thinks this is good, there might be like two other people as well.
When we look at these photos, Sheikha, it's so clear how much your style changed over the last 2 to 3 years. Do you think that's like a very conscious decision? And were there any artists that you were inspired by?
I think at the time, because I had this belief and this narrative that I constantly told myself that I can't draw. So the only thing that I would constantly draw was myself and my, the signature look that now my Instagram has. It's me with my bangs, and it's just the same face over and over again. I think I started off like that because I would tell myself, I can't draw, so I'm just going to keep drawing the same things over and over again. And my initial style started off with me kind of being like, okay, if I can't draw, then I'm going to make this look as random and as not illustrative as possible, so that nobody could tell me that, and this isn't actually like form accurate. It's like, it's okay, I can't draw, so it doesn't matter what anybody else thinks. I will try to make it as kind of random as I possibly could.
Okay. How do people respond to and engage with your work? And does that ever happen in person? Do people recognize you and come up to you?
Back then, never, honestly. I think and barely ever. But now, I think ever since I opened up my online shop, it's been a lot more. I hear stories from people who would tell me that they've seen people wear my stuff in public, or someone would come up to me and I think because I post a lot of myself on my Instagram and me talking, so they would see me in public and they'd be like, oh, you're Sheikha from, like, you draw. So I'm like, yeah, thanks. It's cool, but it always feels nice, always.
Was it difficult for you to share yourself on Instagram? Your work is like a big part of who you are, but in our culture, I think it's a bit tricky when you start sharing photos of yourself to such a public audience.
Yeah, I think yes, in the beginning, definitely I had this belief that I shouldn't share myself online because you have this belief that if you post something on the internet, you can never take it back. But it's like, what am I posting online that was so, like, my face? Like, people could see me in public, you know? So I think for a while it was like that, and I would barely, if ever, post myself online. And it wasn't until COVID happened that I did start posting pictures of myself with my work, posting pictures of myself with my art. And it wasn't until I realized that all the artists that I had a connection with over the internet showed themselves and would actively engage with their audience with their face. And so I opened a TikTok, I started my YouTube channel, and all of those things.
Good for you, honestly. I feel like that takes a lot of strength to be able to do that. Can you tell us what we're looking at here?
I did that in late 2019 when I saw online that abortion rights were being taken away from, like, a specific state in the US. And for some reason, I don't know, I was very affected, even though I don't live in the US or have any, we don't even have those rights. So I was very, I think it hit home because I realized that they were fighting for this right, and we don't have a lot of rights. Today I saw a post that said that Kuwait is the least GCC country with rights for women. And so once I saw that, when I saw the thing that was happening in the US, I began to think about all the stuff that we have in Kuwait. And for me personally, what did we not have agency over basically? And so I started listing all of these stuff, and I started asking my friends, and I'd ask them, what do you guys feel like you don't have agency over? So other than stuff that I felt, it also included stories by other women that they felt like they didn't have agency over specific issues that are listed on the screen.
It's so interesting to see how, we're watching different feminist movements happen around the world. And I mean, I can't believe what you said about Kuwait having the least rights for women. That's, I don't know, I guess surprising. I never thought that was the case. But yeah, you and I did discuss how we remember when women got the right to vote in Kuwait.
Yeah.
It's crazy to think that. Do you think that your work is controversial?
Not really. I think because a lot of the stuff that I think that's a good question, because now that I'm thinking about it, I feel like it's a yes and no. Because on one hand, it's like, no, because a lot of these topics I talk a lot about with a conservative person who is my mother. So I actively talk to her about this. I'm like, how controversial could these subjects be if I can talk to her about this openly? But sometimes there are moments where kind of somebody would come up to me and be like, are you sure you want to post that? Like, I think people project their own insecurities and their own fears onto you. And it's very common, and you have to constantly remind myself that I care about this. So like I said, there has to be one other person who cares about this just as much as I do. And I'm not catering to the people who are afraid and who are, who don't want things to change.
And I think what's great about what you're doing is you're creating spaces to have conversations that, for women who experience very similar stories, but I guess we've all been too embarrassed or just didn't have the space to talk about it. So by creating these works, even just putting on Instagram, like a simple share opens that dialogue and gives people the chance to talk about that.
Yeah.
Were there any memorable conversations that you had with people, maybe online, when they saw your work?
I think I feel like I have a lot of conversations now with, maybe that's why, again, I don't feel like my work is that controversial, because a lot of the people that do follow me, the conversations that I end up having with them, a lot of them agree, and I end up hearing their stories and their frustrations. So I feel like it always makes me feel like I'm in the majority, but then I have to remind myself that I'm actually in the minority. Mm-hmm. So I think the most important thing is just when I was 3 years ago looking for those self-care illustrations, now I'm trying to make different kind of illustrations that maybe one person would look at and is like, okay, I thought I was the only person who was thinking about this. I thought I was the only person who didn't want to get married or didn't want to have to do this or didn't have to want to do that. But this girl is putting it online, so clearly everybody knows what she does and doesn't want to do.
Yeah. And I think what's amazing about this is that also it's someone who, like me, you grew up in Kuwait. Everyone else who grew up in Kuwait, we're not growing up in Kuwait watching American posting this and then having our parents say like, oh, don't listen to these American voices. You know, you are the voice of the young generation in Kuwait, which is great. So tell me, what does being an artist in Kuwait mean today? Do you have support, and where do you get your inspiration from?
I think I'm grateful that I do have a lot of support. Like my family's supportive. Because I have a very open dialogue with my mother. She's very supportive. My friends are very supportive, and I had a professor at university who was extremely supportive of everything that I wanted to do. So she really gave me the foundation to do anything. And I always knew that I had a safe space that I could create, and I wasn't worried because there were people that I actively looked up to that agreed with the things that I was talking about. And I think being a woman and being an Arab woman in specific, you end up caring so much about what everybody thinks of you. But what's more important is you have to ask yourself, would I ask these people about very specific issues that I have in my own life? If I don't ask them these issues, then why would I care about anything they have to say, really? You have to have I think it's very important to have very specific people that you really care about their opinion. And that's what matters. And I think being an artist in Kuwait is it's a paradox. On one hand, you're trying really hard to protect yourself and protect your environment and protect your beliefs and everything, but at the same time, you're under a microscope, not even because for being an artist, for being a woman. So at the same time, it's like I'm actively showing, but I'm also scared. So it's constantly living in this gray area of being afraid, but wanting to do it anyway.
Yeah. And we did talk about how putting yourself out there is really the first step to moving out of the comfort, because being an Arab woman means living in a lot of comfort. And I think that also looks at how different feminist movements were in different countries within the Arab world even. This specific type of comfort that you have in Kuwait makes you too comfortable to even want to move out of
If you
that.
feel almost like you're wanting more, because living in Kuwait, we have such a privileged lifestyle, and something that if we feel like if we ask for more, you have everything. What else do you want? What else do you want? And it's very gaslighting, and they gaslight you, you gaslight yourself. You end up asking yourself, who am I to start thinking about this and wanting this? And you feel ashamed. But at the end of the day, the only people that are trying to make you feel ashamed are either afraid themselves of things changing. And we can see that now with the kind of Me Too movement that's happening in Kuwait, and the response that a lot of men are having, and even women that are like, what's wrong with harassment? You're putting boundaries between men and women. And it's like, what are you? I'm sorry. I care less about the boundaries. I care more about women living, just being alive. Just that's my main concern over here. You hear these horrific stories about what is actually happening to women. Like, and my issues are very small in comparison to the large amount of horror stories that are happening around us. And when you talk about them, it's like, why is this your problem? You don't have these problems. It's not happening to you. And it's like, why does this have to happen to me for me to care? And that's a problem. It's like the lack of empathy that we have completely to other people's existence. It's this entitlement, and it's very strange, and people don't realize the confinements they're in until something happens. Like, even if it's something as small as your parents being like, no, we don't want you leaving the house at this time, no, we don't want you traveling alone. It's something so small that in the grand scheme of things, you're like, well, who cares? But what it actually means is, we won't let you. Who do you think you are to think that you have the ownership over your own life? Like, it's just wild when you think about it, and it like hurts my head sometimes. But Yani, you have to think about it.
Maybe something that you're talking about today isn't relevant to you today, but maybe in 5 years it might be relevant to you, or maybe it'll connect you to people in different ways. And I do think that one of the best things about this is like you are creating the space to talk about these things in our own home countries. It's clear that you cater a lot to the Kuwaiti audience, but do you also try to reach a different audience, like maybe a more Western audience?
I feel like growing when around 2019 I read this book called Can We All Be Feminist, and it was a book with like 17 series of accounts from different types of people around the world, like trans women, disabled women, older women, so many different types of people. And so each of them were talking about how and there was one narrative specifically that I think she was an Indian woman, and she was talking about how she felt like she couldn't relate to Western feminism because how can I start burning my bra when, like I can't even I don't have basic human rights. And that's when I think my mentality shifted, and the whole concept of, when people tell you that feminism isn't for the Arab region, it's a Western mentality. It's like the Western plague or something. But in reality, it's like, I don't need to cater to Western women. They might be interested, but my core focus is always people in the Eastern region. Like that's my main focus because there aren't as many voices, especially in the Gulf. And I was telling you yesterday that a lot of the books that I read when I was reading about like feminist theory, at the beginning I used to read a lot of books written by white women, but I couldn't relate to them. And then when I started reading stories by Black women, and I started seeing a specific narrative that didn't exist to me before. And slowly that transitioned from Audre Lorde into Nawal al-Saadawi. And Nawal al-Saadawi, a lot of Arab parents are very against her. And I've gotten so many messages on Instagram, like a lot of girls are like, my parents don't let me read her. And I realized that a lot of the books that I was consuming from Arab women were either Egyptian, Lebanese, Palestinian, Jordanian, but barely, if ever, Kuwaiti and Qatari. And maybe I have difficulty reading in Arabic, so I have to look for the translated version. But the first book that I ever found that was written in English for Arab women was Hayal Maghri's book, Women in Kuwait. And I was honestly ready to start a revolution the day I finished the book. Because it was for the first time that I felt like everything that was happening, I could finally understand. And I feel like there's this very negative stereotype that like Arabic is our first language. And I wish I was super eloquent in it, but it's hard for me. And it's hard for a lot of people that grow up in the Arab region. And I felt like because I didn't have language didn't come easy for me, I had to exclude myself from the Arab narrative. And I couldn't exist in the Western narrative or in the Eastern narrative. And it was difficult. And it wasn't until you have to remind yourself that like Kuwait is changing. The world is changing. The world is no longer a single langular country. Like Kuwait, people don't only speak Arabic anymore. And so that's why I think I started creating art specifically that was English and Arabic. It's because I want to cater for people who speak Arabic, and I want to cater for people who speak English, but also the people who can speak Arabic but have difficulties, like so many of us. Yeah. And I could go back in time and pay more attention to 8th grade Arabic, but that just can't happen now.
I also want to talk about the residency you did with the Arab British Center. Tell us about how that happened.
So I did a cultural exchange with the Arab British Center in the summer of 2019. It was funded by the British Council, and I went with 4 other artists to the UK. And the main thing that I saw, the main difference and the main focus that I had was how privacy was never an issue for them. Like we were walking into people's houses, like looking at their studios. It was amazing. And all the conversations we were having, the stories that were being told, it's like everything was talked about. It was incredible. And so when I came back to Kuwait and I had to think of my project proposal, I talked about how I interviewed 4 people in my surroundings that came from a marginalized kind of community. For example, a trans person, a person who married a non-Kuwaiti, a Shi'i girl who took off her hijab, any stories that are not very like a girl who grew up stateless, Bidun. These narratives, I audio recorded them and I transcribed everything. But I realized that as much as I wanted to let go of privacy, that I still had to protect myself. I had to protect these people. And so I ended up creating forms out of the ways that they spoke. And then I kept abstracting the forms in a way of, it wasn't even self-censorship, but more like like a way of protecting myself and them. And so by doing that, I could explain it, but still keep it as a form, something that could be digested rather than just like in your face, kind of screaming imagery. And actually, I remember when I showed one of the people that I initially helped me with understand the project, he told me that he felt like it was stained glass windows in a church. And in a way that it was interesting because I felt like suddenly those paintings had so much importance that they were almost equatable to being in a church. And but these figures weren't even being talked about in our community whatsoever. So it just makes you think that what happens if we give a voice, even like what is my tiny microphone compared to different scales that could be given.
Yeah, we talk a lot about how things are changing in Kuwait already and how these conversations are being had, but what do you think is still missing from the conversation?
I think definitely uh, as much as we don't want to censor and we wish we could express freely, that isn't really an opportunity. In a way, talking about feminist issues is actually a lot safer than other issues I would like to discuss because everyone can relate to feminist issues. But when you start micro analyzing, you start to go into kind of dangerous territory. And I think sometimes I think we're maybe a 50 years a bit too early, if that makes sense, for a lot of the other issues that need to be discussed. And I feel like a lot of it is out of fear because like I said, coming from a like everyone who comes from in Kuwait, who comes from a very specific background, privilege, you have a lot to lose compared to maybe other figures that didn't have a lot to lose. So again, we can't look at Western feminism as kind of like a blueprint because we don't have the privilege of that kind of civil liberty. It doesn't exist as much.
So there's a lot of different symbols in your work. The location is typically in a house, and you've mentioned that a lot of the inspiration comes from conversations that you have with your mom. So how does your mom feel about these illustrations?
She honestly loves them, surprisingly. I'm a big fan. I think because she told me this once that she feels like it allows her to step back from the conversation as a third person. Because so sometimes when we are cultural perpetuators or we regurgitate what we've been told from centuries down, it feels like this is what's true. Why would I not agree with this when my mother told me this and her mother told her that and her mother told her that? And so she says sometimes when she looks at them, she's like, oh, why would I say something like that? That's so stupid. Like, that's so funny. Why would I do that? Why would I say that? But like 3 hours ago, she was saying the exact same thing to me. And so sometimes it's not as much about me versus you. It's just about how can I show you this from a different perspective so you understand that it's not me versus you. It's us versus the problem, which is the system, the institution that's put in place.
Of course. So tell me about the eyes. What are these eyes that we see repeated in your work?
I think it's basically but I didn't realize that I used to put those eyes. It wasn't something that I put in consciously. It was more subconscious. And so after realizing that I put those eyes, I began to see that it was the internalized male gaze that all women from the Arab region have internalized. For example, when my mother tells me, why would you wear that? Go change. It's not her. She doesn't care what I'm wearing. She cares about how men see me and how men will view me and how what will happen from that. And obviously we all have to have sympathy for our mothers who had to internalize that. And we internalize that ourselves. Like I have my favorite green jeans, and every time I wear them, I'm like, how do I look? Oh my god, does my butt look too big? Do I look like this? Do I look like that? And me and my friends would laugh because when I was in university, it was pretty much 90% girls because just architecture in KU was like that. And I wore whatever I wanted. I didn't even think twice. And that was because I was like, wow, this is an environment where the male gaze isn't around every corner. I felt like I was in control. And when I was in control, I could be who I actually was. But after a while, it's like now that I graduated and after COVID and being at home so much, that fear comes back. And I feel like that's why a lot of the times in my illustrations, I'd make myself wear like the coolest clothes. It's because I don't have that privilege a lot of the time. It's kind of like the little cartoon from Lizzie McGuire. That's me.
Oh yeah, that's so sweet. I like that. I feel like a lot of times the male gaze is also carried into the female gaze too, in a way. Like women then tend to project that onto other women, and we end up, without having conversations, it could become very toxic. And so this is why having conversations like this is very good, because hopefully women won't be telling other women like, don't wear this, you look inappropriate or whatever. The topic that you talk about is like very serious, but you make it in like a very playful way. Can you tell us about how you chose to do that and the choice of colors?
I think the thing is, when I initially started, I knew that I wanted to talk about specific issues, but at the same time, when you discuss the specific issues and you put the colors that relate to the issue, it feels very like either sad or bland, and I didn't want to portray that image. I didn't want it to be like the first thing that you feel was like exhausting. I wanted to kind of the colors contrast the seriousness of the situation, which a lot of the times is what it feels like to be an Arab woman. You are constantly a paradox. You have this kind of bubble that surrounds you of shelter and security, but in reality that shelter and security becomes a glass box, and you realize that as much as it is protected, it's also suffocating. So the colors contrast sometimes the seriousness of the issues and kind of the playfulness. And I think when I had initially started, and before I started using Procreate on my iPad, I used to illustrate on Photoshop, and Photoshop used to give me the opportunity to like try out 50 different renditions, and a lot of the time I would have 50 renditions of the same drawing. And that allowed me to kind of realize specific color theories, specific colors that I knew work together. And from that, I was able to build my color scheme that I have today.
How do you feel like your background in architecture still brings its way into your work today?
It helped me if I wanted to do architecture. That by the time I got out of it, I was like, I could really do anything by this point, and it allowed me to, ironically, when I started illustrating, my architecture skills got better and my designing skills got better. So they really ended up helping each other. So I tried to bring that kind of the same discipline that I had in architecture into illustration. And especially now, ever since I graduated, I realized that my interior ability to draw interior spaces and draw perspectives have kind of risen exponentially, especially in my sketchbook and my work in general. That I'm grateful that I did go into architecture, because I think it's something that may have taken me a lot longer.
Tell us about this piece.
Yes, so this piece was called Inside the Glass Box, and I had originally done the sketch for Vice Arabia for one of their columns. And when I did it, they didn't actually end up choosing it, so I was glad because I could use it for my own advantage. And so I had done the drawing, and I realized that the subject originally wasn't about that, like this, the being an Arab woman. It was just I realized that this is really it was a metaphor for what being an Arab woman was. It's like you are constantly watching yourself from the eyes of other people inside of kind of like this glass box, feeling sheltered but feeling suffocated, and feeling you're just living the same day and the same life sometimes over and over again. And when you try to explain, then me and my friends have this conversation a lot, and when you try to explain to our fathers or our brothers, and they're like, they think it's such a dangerous world out there, so we have to be in this place, and wouldn't you rather be in this bubble rather than exposed to the elements? And a lot of the time it's like, yes, like I want the opportunity to be, I want the choice. And that's at the end of the day what freedom is. It's not about being able to do whatever you want whenever you want. It's being able to have the choice to do those things. Like today, me and my friend were watching the Britney Spears documentary, which I highly recommend for everybody. And so Britney Spears is under a conservatorship. And honestly, I was telling her, I was like, this is literally every Arab woman that I know. But this is insane. Like, and it's true. It's like, okay, we have majority rights, but her having to ask to do everything, and I was just like, this is us, It's like your lifestyle really depends on how forgiving your family and culture is. And some of us are a lot more privileged than others, and we need to recognize that. But I think a lot of the times whenever I talk to people about these specific topics and they're like, why are your illustrations so sad and serious? Like when they actually talk to me about it, I'm like, but it's not, it is serious. It doesn't have to be sad. It's sad because you don't want to do anything about it.
Yeah.
And yeah.
I think sometimes it's also not just the immediate family that can be the pressure on people, but society, it's extended family. I think the more that we teach people that you shouldn't stick your nose where it doesn't belong, the more women will hopefully have more freedom to really just do whatever they want, whenever they want.
Exactly. And it's having the trust that women know what's best for them. And it's ironic that a lot of the times we're not giving the trust until we get married, but it's not really, they don't have trust in you, they have trust in the guy they just met like 6 months ago. It's like it's odd when you really think about it. It's strange. It's just that we don't question it because a lot of us see marriage as a way out. So we think, oh, rather than thinking what is wrong in the principle here, we think, okay, let me just try to get married quick just so I can get out of here. But in reality, it's like, no, there's a deeper issue at hand here.
Yeah. We have a question from Theba. She says she likes looking at your art, and each sentence that's shared in it makes her think about the roots and the consequences that each sentence has. She feels a sense of purpose behind them. Does having an audience make you take much care regarding the words you use in your art, or has it always been an expression of a voice that's been growing in you way before developing the platform you have now? And what do you see next for the women's movements in Kuwait?
I think honestly, yes for the first thing and the second thing that she said. But ironically, I had more strength talking about the issues that I do and giving the words that I say once I grew a larger audience, because then I really felt like I wasn't alone. You know, when you are alone, you feel like a lot of the times you do end up gaslighting yourself that this is not that big of an issue. But when you have a lot of other people who are like, oh, same, you know, this is so funny, it actually hurts. Like, no, it hurts because it's funny in a way. And that's when you're like, okay, I'm doing something right. And that was the most important thing for me. And I think with the women's movement, I think we have a bit of a way to go, to be honest, because there are a lot of issues that we've been fighting for so long, like abolish 153 and just the removal of honor killings and the harassment issues, and there are so many more. It's insane, but I do see that things are changing, and thankfully, because of social media, because we're able to have this sort of connection. Ironically, the women's movement was a lot tighter in Kuwait, was a lot closer knit, like in the 90s and the 80s. And then after we got the vote, it kind of started to simmer. But I also think that it's because of the lack of representation in a lot of governmental spaces, like all men being in parliament. Yani that was the most disappointing day of the year, honestly, for me. Even with Corona happening, that was like so sad. I couldn't believe it. But I think the more we get women interested in politics and interested in change for themselves and looking for their best interest as citizens, then we will have huge change.
How do you think we can mobilize women to get out of the comfort and get out of the fear to actually try to mobilize this change?
I think honestly, just having conversations, like really, I saw this on Amboy. It's like basically a media platform on Instagram. I highly recommend everyone to go on it. And there is this comedian, her name is Sheikha Al Habshi, and she talks about how she had a video called Shughl Harim, which is like women's work, and how everyone used to say that politics wasn't women's work. And she was like, how about if instead of saying that, each person comes up with one law that affects women directly, and to discuss these laws, like, did you know that this was happening? And once you have 6 girls, let's say, who talk about 6 laws in a span of 12 months, imagine if they just met once, that's over 72 laws a year that they didn't know existed. And so it's something just as small as that, as questioning. That's what makes the difference, I think.
I do love this quote. Do you want to read it and tell us what it means?
So this was in response to the Me Too movement that's currently happening in Kuwait. A lot of the times it's like we hear a lot of men say this, where they're like, imagine if it was your sister or your mother. And it's like, I don't have to be your sister or your mother or your daughter or your wife for you to care about me. And I think that brings it back to the concept of empathy, that we should have empathy for each other, whether we know each other or not.
You do this a lot with your work where you write it in English and also in Arabic. Do you think about it in English or in Arabic first? And was there like a specific target when you actively decided to start doing it in both languages?
I think it depends on the like who I'm having the conversation with. A lot of my illustrations that happen with my mom, for example, they happened in Arabic, so I write them down in Arabic. But the ones where I'm just thinking about it by myself, like this one that you're looking at, where it's like I'm at the doctor's office for my back, that initially, well, I thought about it in English because I do think in English. But I posted it first, like I think maybe 6 months ago, and it didn't have that much of a response. But when I posted it in Arabic, it had a huge response, because the concept of honor, it doesn't exist as much in the English language, بالكويت, but the concept of sharaf al-aila exists very much. So everyone could relate to inte sharaf al-aila, basically, rather than you are your family's honor. So it's just really about how it resonates with people. And that's what I realized that was more important sometimes. So I try to do it both ways, but I recognize that like speaking like in Arabic allows the message to kind of move farther more than I want.
I completely agree. And I think part of what's great about it is also that there aren't many illustrations. I mean, I don't really know any illustrations in Arabic that cover this topic. So I think that's great. So we talked about the topic of hasad. How does hasad play a part in your life? And also now, given how public you are about your life?
I think and personally for me, I never believed that I could ever get hasad for my work, because I was like, if there are artists all around the world living their best lives, and how would I ever get hasad, But I think there is the jealousy, I feel like, is a little bit different than hasad, because hasad, and maybe because it's in Arabic, so it feels very intense. But I think the concept of jealousy can exist very much within artists, but I think it's up to us to use it as a good kind of facilitator to get what we want. And I was telling Glara about this yesterday, that one of the reasons that I started doing illustrations in Arabic was that I saw another illustrator who had done something and their work kind of blew up, and I was like, but I've been talking about this for so long, so why is my work not going anywhere? And a friend of mine at university had told me it's because people don't remember those conversations in English. They remember them in Arabic. Salfet, Shona Khalij, we remember it when our mom or dad tells us in Arabic. We don't remember it in English. How can I let you? And it's very rare for your parents who have this mentality to be speaking to you in English, especially بالكويت. Ever since I heard that, I realized that you could use your feelings of envy or jealousy in a way that to push you to change your art, because at the end of the day, it's not about me versus her. It's about us making a change towards something better.
Absolutely. I think what's great also about your work is that it makes it easier to have these difficult conversations. It's so much harder to tweet about this, whereas when you have an image, I think this is like one of the strengths of art. I think that a lot of people don't realize your age. I was surprised when I found out you're 22 years old. How do you feel like that plays into your character and the way that you create this work?
I'm the youngest of 3 girls, so I felt like I had kind of a pass for anything that I kind of wanted to do, because the focus wasn't on me. I was always seen as the young, like she's the youngest, she doesn't get it, it's fine, like just push her to the side, her views might seem weird, but it's okay, she's growing up. And so I think that gave me the permission to do whatever I wanted, because no one was looking at me. Everyone was looking at my older sister. So it was like, I could do whatever I wanted until I graduated university. And it's like, oh, like my parents realized that, wait, this is actually something. You could do this as a job. And I am. And it's because nobody was paying attention to me before about this kind of stuff. So I could exist. And sometimes I think that's the best place to exist. It's like, you have to focus on using what people view as maybe weaknesses to your strength, seeing as like, if you're younger, you don't have to be naive. You can do whatever you want. Who's stopping you, really?
We have a question from Farah. How do you navigate different voices and opinions from women within your own generation?
I think a lot of the times because I have a very specific view that though women with different opinions aren't drawn to my work, they aren't drawn to my page. So a lot of the times, if I have gotten a few very, very negative responses. And a lot of the time, I just have to remind myself that this has nothing to do with me. Like, would I ever go and actively be angry at someone else doing what they want? And I'm like, as long as you're not actively hurting anyone, then I don't think it's an issue. But I think it's important to have those conversations and try to see other people's points of view. And if you don't agree with it, then try to create a conversation rather than like hiding away in your own bubble.
We briefly touched on self-censorship. How do you fight those fears and just go ahead and post something that you know might not be well received?
I think it's more like kind of a lot of the time I just do it anyway and then just wait to see the response. Like I think in 2018, that was my first time I ever did anything that I was like scared about, and it was a drawing about like choosing tampons over pads, and I was terrified of what my family was going to say, like scared to death, like I was anxious all day. Then I posted it, and a few hours later my sister comes into my room and she's looking for like a hair tie, and I'm like waiting for her to say something, and she doesn't say anything. So I'm like, did you see my illustration on Instagram? And she's like, yeah. And she looks at me like with a glare, and then she walks out. And I was like, okay, if that's the most I'm gonna get, then I'm good. I'm safe. Like clearly it's not that big of a deal.
There was one instance you mentioned that the people's responses were a bit harsher, and that was when you did the Saad al-Higazi post. Can you tell us about
Yeah.
what happened
There was a lot of negative response that maybe didn't happen when I initially posted it, but sometimes when I get like a large surge of followers, sometimes they'll like go through all of my work and they'll see that and they'll be very angry about it. And for me, I find that hilarious because if you think I'm talking about all these other issues, why would you think I would be closed-minded about other issues? And so at first I didn't want to be afraid. I was like, no, like let them comment hateful things. But then I realized that in a way this was their only strength, so I ended up just turning off the comments for that specific post, and I was like, I'd rather memorialize her, and that was what was important rather than all of these random opinions.
Yeah. For people who don't know about the Saad al-Higazi, can you briefly tell us what that was about?
It was basically about a queer activist who was in Egypt who had gone to a concert and she was holding up the rainbow flag, and she was put in prison for a very long time, and she was assaulted and harassed by the police at that time. And then when she finally ended up moving to Canada, she couldn't really escape all of the trauma that she had suffered. So she had committed suicide, and she had left her last words to the world where it was like, you were a horrible world, but I forgive you anyway. And so that was what I ended up illustrating, was her image with her final words.
We have a question from Faye. She's asking what the process of choosing the colors for your illustrations are.
I start off with I have very like 3 specific colors that I always use, which is bright green, neon, kind of magenta, and dark blue. And from those 3, I end up finding colors that represent the scene. But having a specific specific amount that you end up using regularly allows me to create work that is focused and centered, because sometimes when you have so many colors you end up getting lost in the amount. But I also think my Instagram feed plays kind of a role, because I try to because a lot of the work I get from Instagram, and I'm catering for Instagram, that my art centers around that, if that makes sense, like just to make it all look cohesive, because I think it's important to look at who's looking at your work, just as if you were in a gallery.
We have a comment saying you're very encouraging, and despite how difficult the society is, it's amazing to see how far you've come. We also have a final question from Sada. Sada says, your illustrations tend to be very expressive. Do you think that explicitly writing scenarios in your illustrations is necessary to get the message across for such an audience that tends to avoid these topics?
100%. A lot of the times I do include a saying, and because I want to talk about a specific issue, and I feel like a lot of the times people don't feel like reading captions ever. So it feels like there is a main plot that I'm trying to get to, and sometimes you just have to add a few words so people know, like, okay, she's talking about this specific issue. And at the end of the day, I think an illustration, the best thing about it is that it doesn't only have to be, it's not like a painting where it's words, or like it's words, or it's like a drawing. It's more like, no, it could be both. And I think that's the change of digital illustration that's happening now.
So my final question for you is, what comes next? Where do you want to see your work go? And what are some goals you have?
One of my goals is that I would like to finish my education, pursue a master's in illustration. I want to eventually become a children's book illustrator and like a graphic novel illustrator eventually, kind of like Persepolis and by Marijan Satrapi. And like, if you guys don't know her, you should read her. I feel like I want to create a narrative that I didn't see while I was growing up.
Amazing. I really hope we get to see that. Everyone, please follow Sheikha and stay in touch with her work. It's amazing. Thank you so much, Sheikha, for joining. This was amazing.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks for everyone who joined.